Today we're diving into some techniques for having better, more productive, and persuasive political conversations, even when things get a little heated.
Yeah.
That's a pretty common challenge.
It is, especially today.
Yeah. So we're looking at this website called Smart Politics, and it focuses on using persuasive communication to try to bridge those divides. And their approach is really built on this idea that, and I found this really interesting, that it's not too late to change minds.
Yeah.
Which is kind of hopeful.
It is. What I find really fascinating about Smart Politics is this emphasis on really kind of avoiding those sort of like unproductive arguments and instead really focusing on fostering genuine connection. They even suggest that, by building these emotional connections, it can actually help people step back from conspiracy theories.
That's a pretty bold claim. Connection cures Magie. But how does that actually work?
Well, MAGA refers to the Make America Great Again slogan and movement associated with a particular political ideology. And Smart Politics argues that by building genuine relationships, understanding, we can help people kind of step back from those rigid ideologies, including those associated with that movement.
So it's less about winning an argument and more about actually trying to understand where someone's coming from.
Right.
Even if you fundamentally disagree with their views.
Precisely. And that understanding can actually create space for more productive dialogue. Smart Politics suggests it's not about sacrificing your values or anything like that, but rather finding ways to communicate them more effectively and persuasively.
Okay, so how do they suggest we actually do that?
Well, Smart Politics breaks down their approach into 3 key principles. The first is lowering defensiveness, the second is connecting and building trust, and the third is reducing bias.
Those sound pretty straightforward in theory, but I imagine putting them into practice, especially in the heat of the moment, can be a little bit tricky.
Absolutely. But Smart Politics does provide some practical strategies for each of these principles. So, for example, when it comes to lowering defensiveness, they suggest creating what they call safer conversations, where people feel heard and respected. And one tactic they recommend is shifting from accusatory language.
Okay.
Like, you're wrong, to more inquisitive phrasing like, I see things differently.
Oh, that's interesting. So instead of immediately putting someone on the defensive, you're sort of inviting them to share their perspective.
Exactly.
You're acknowledging that there might be more than one way to look at an issue.
Exactly. It's about shifting the tone from a battle to a conversation.
Yeah. Right.
So instead of attacking someone's viewpoint, you're creating an opening for a genuine exchange of ideas.
Right.
I can see how that would be a more productive approach.
Yeah, and that leads us to the second principle, connecting and building trust. This is where Smart Politics really emphasizes the importance of authenticity and vulnerability. Wait, vulnerability in a political conversation? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does.
Isn't that a little risky?
It is.
Couldn't that be misinterpreted?
It definitely takes courage, and yes, there's always a risk of being misunderstood. But Smart Politics suggests that when you're willing to share your own doubts or struggles or experiences related to the topic, it can actually create a sense of shared humanity.
So you're not just presenting a polished argument, but you're also showing that you're a real person who has grappled with these issues.
Exactly. And that can make you more relatable and trustworthy.
I suppose it could also help break down those stereotypes we often have about people who hold different political views. If you're willing to be vulnerable, it's harder to see someone as just the enemy.
That's a key point. It's about moving beyond those simplistic labels and engaging with individuals on a human level.
Okay, so we've covered lowering defensiveness, we've talked about building trust. What about that third principle, reducing bias? How do we encourage people to challenge their own assumptions and see things from new perspectives?
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in. Smart Politics encourages people to question their own assumptions, to look for logical fallacies, and to evaluate evidence really carefully. And they suggest that by encouraging these qualities, we can actually help people break free from those rigid ideologies and engage in more nuanced thinking.
But how do you even begin to do that, especially when we're all bombarded with information from so many sources these days?
It's definitely a challenge. Smart Politics emphasizes the importance of being aware of our own biases.
Right.
And the ways in which our emotions can influence our thinking. They suggest that by just being more self-aware, we can start to identify and challenge those biases.
It sounds like it takes a certain level of humility to admit that we might be wrong or that our perspective might be limited.
It does. But that humility can be incredibly powerful in opening our minds to new possibilities.
Okay, so we've got these 3 core principles: lowering defensiveness, building trust, and reducing bias. Now let's dive into some of the specifics from the Smart Politics website, because I found some things that really caught my eye.
Me too. One that stood out to me was an article called "The 10 Types of Trust You Need to Persuade a Republican."
Okay.
Now, that title definitely makes you wonder what those trust-building strategies are all about.
Right. Especially because they're specifically talking about persuading Republicans. It seems like they're tackling those conversations that often feel the most difficult.
Yes. It suggests that they're trying to bridge a very specific political divide. Let's explore this article a bit further and see what insights it offers.
Definitely. I'm really curious to see how these 10 types of trust connect to those 3 principles we just discussed and how they can be applied in real-world conversations.
Let's dive in. This article on the 10 types of trust, it kind of digs deeper into the nuances of building connections, especially in these challenging political conversations we've been talking about.
It does seem like a pretty comprehensive approach. What are some of these types of trust they're talking about?
Well, they start with what they call social trust, which is all about building rapport and just showing basic respect, kind of like we were talking about earlier. It's about seeing the other person as, a fellow human being worthy of your time and attention.
Okay, so it's that foundation of connection that makes everything else possible.
Exactly.
What comes after that?
Then they move into competence trust, which I think is really interesting.
Okay.
Because it's about demonstrating that you actually know what you're talking about, not just sharing opinions, but backing them up with facts, with evidence.
So you can't just say, I think this policy is bad.
Yeah.
You have to be able to explain why using, credible sources and logical reasoning.
Precisely. It's about showing that you've done your homework and that your opinions are informed. Then they go into moral trust, which focuses on aligning your values with those of the person you're talking to.
This one seems a little tricky, especially when it comes to politics.
It is.
How do you find common ground on values when it seems like everybody's views are so polarized?
Well, Smart Politics suggests that even if you have very different political views, you might be surprised by the underlying moral principles that you actually both share. Maybe you both value fairness.
Yeah.
Or compassion. Or a strong work ethic.
Yeah.
It's about finding those points of intersection, even if they're not immediately obvious.
So instead of assuming you have nothing in common, you're looking for those shared values.
Yeah.
That can kind of create a bridge of understanding.
Exactly. Then we get into emotional trust, which goes back to that idea of vulnerability we were discussing earlier.
Right.
It's about demonstrating empathy and understanding, showing that you care about the other person's feelings, their experiences.
And that's where sharing personal anecdotes can be really powerful, right?
Yeah.
If you can connect your viewpoint to a real life experience, it can make it more relatable and less abstract.
Absolutely. Stories have a way of really kind of cutting through the noise and reaching people on a much deeper level. And it goes both ways, Are you genuinely listening to their stories and their experiences?
Mm.
Are you trying to understand their perspective?
So it's not just about expressing your own emotions, but also being receptive to the emotions of the other person.
Right. It's about creating a space where both people feel heard and understood, even if you don't ultimately agree.
Okay, we've got social trust, confidence trust, moral trust, and emotional trust. What other types of trust do they mention?
They also talk about logical trust,
Good.
which is about presenting clear and well-reasoned arguments, avoiding those logical fallacies,
Okay.
and emotional appeals that can often kind of derail conversations.
Logical fallacies.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of what that means? I'm not sure if all of our listeners will be familiar with that term.
Sure. A logical fallacy is basically a flaw in reasoning that makes an argument invalid.
Okay.
So, for example, a really common one is what's called the ad hominem fallacy, where you're attacking the person making the argument instead of addressing the argument itself.
So instead of saying, that policy is a terrible idea, you say, the person who came up with that policy is an idiot.
Exactly. That's an ad hominem attack. It doesn't actually engage with the substance of the policy at all. It just tries to discredit the person behind it.
Okay, so logical trust is about being, intellectually honest
Yeah.
and transparent in your reasoning. What comes next?
Well, then there's group trust, which is kind of an interesting one.
Yeah.
It's about showing that you understand and respect the groups that the person identifies with, even if you don't belong to those groups yourself.
So, if someone identifies strongly with a particular political party, you're acknowledging the importance of that identity to them, even if you don't agree with everything that party stands for.
Precisely. It's about recognizing the complexity of group identity and avoiding those sweeping generalizations that can really shut down a conversation.
That makes sense. It's about seeing the individual within the group, not just the group itself. Okay, what else?
We also have past trust, which focuses on acknowledging past wrongs and demonstrating a commitment to doing better in the future.
So if you're talking about like a political issue with a long and complicated history, you're not trying to just like sweep that history under the rug.
Right.
You're owning up to past mistakes.
Yep.
And showing that you've learned from them.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility and demonstrating a willingness to grow. Then there's intuition trust, which is a little more intangible. It's about trusting your gut feeling about the person you're talking to.
So like, are you getting a sense that this person is genuine
Yeah.
and trustworthy? Or are you sensing that something feels a little off?
Right. It's about paying attention to those subtle cues and trusting your instincts.
Okay.
And then finally, they mentioned benevolence trust, which is about demonstrating that your intentions are good.
So even if you disagree on a particular issue, you're approaching the conversation with like a spirit of goodwill.
Yeah.
We're seeking understanding, not just victory.
That's the key. And I think it goes back to that idea of connection being more powerful than division.
Okay, so we've covered all 10 types of trust.
We have.
That's a lot to take in, but it seems like they all kind of tie back to those 3 core principles we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Lowering defensiveness, building trust, and reducing bias.
Exactly. These 10 types of trust provide a more nuanced framework for putting those principles into practice.
Yeah.
It's about being intentional in your communication and approaching these challenging conversations with empathy, with understanding, and with respect.
So how do all these pieces kind of fit together?
I think the smart politics approach is ultimately about shifting our mindset. It's about moving away from that us versus them mentality and recognizing that we're all in this together, you know? Even if we have different political views, we all want a better future. And that starts with being willing to listen to each other, to learn from each other, and to find those points of connection that can bridge the divides.
So you're saying it's not about changing someone's mind overnight, but rather about planting seeds, nurturing relationships that could lead to more productive dialogue down the road.
Precisely. It's a long game, but I think it's a game worth playing.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the 3 principles of persuasive communication.
We have.
We've delved into the 10 types of trust. We've talked about the importance of shifting our mindset.
We've also looked at how to avoid common pitfalls like those logical fallacies and how to approach those difficult conversations with more empathy and understanding.
Right. But how does this translate into action? How can our listeners take these ideas and actually apply them in their own lives?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore as we continue this deep dive. Let's take a moment to just reflect on what we've learned so far, and then consider how we can put these insights into practice.
So we've unpacked these 10 types of trust and how they can help us navigate these conversations more effectively. But it's one thing to understand the concepts, it's another to actually apply them in real life.
Yeah, for sure. That's where the rubber meets the road, right? Taking those insights and actually turning them into action.
So let's say you're facing a challenging political discussion with a family member, friend, colleague. Where do you even begin?
Well, I think the first step is to check your own mindset. Are you going into this conversation wanting to win or prove the other person wrong? Or are you going in wanting to actually understand their perspective and find common ground?
Yeah, that's a good point. If you're already in that like combative mindset, it's going to be tough to build trust or connection.
Right. It's about shifting from debate to dialogue. And that starts with being willing to listen. Really listen, not just waiting for your turn to speak, but actively trying to understand where they're coming from.
And that means putting aside your own judgments and assumptions, right?
Exactly. It's about creating that space where the other person feels safe to share their thoughts and feelings without fear of being, attacked or ridiculed.
So fostering that social trust we were talking about earlier. Showing basic respect. Acknowledging their humanity.
Precisely. And as you're listening, you can start to look for those points of connection, like those shared values or experiences that can help bridge the divide.
Right, so maybe you both care deeply about the environment or education, economic opportunity. Even if you disagree on the specifics, the shared value can at least be a starting point.
Exactly, and that's where that moral trust comes in. It's about finding that common ground on values, even if your political views might diverge.
Okay, so you're listening, you're looking for those shared values, and you're really trying to understand their perspective. What about expressing your own viewpoint? How do you do that in a way that's persuasive and doesn't just shut down the conversation?
Well, this is where that competence trust and logical trust are really crucial. You need to be able to articulate your viewpoint clearly, back it up with facts and evidence, avoid those logical fallacies we were talking about earlier, really focus on presenting a well-reasoned argument.
So it's not about just saying, I feel this way, but rather, I believe this because, and then providing evidence.
Right. And it's also important to be mindful of your tone and your body language. Are you coming across as condescending, aggressive, or are you conveying a sense of openness, respect, even if you disagree?
That's where that emotional trust comes into play again, right?
Yes.
It's not just the words you're saying, but how you're saying them.
Exactly. And remember, vulnerability can be really powerful. Sharing a personal anecdote that relates to the issue can make your argument more relatable. It can help build a deeper connection with the other person.
So you're not just presenting like a cold, hard argument, but also showing the human side of the issue.
Right. And don't be afraid to acknowledge the other side's valid points, you know?
Okay.
It shows that you're listening.
Yeah.
And that you're not just trying to steamroll them with your own perspective.
It seems like a lot of this comes down to intention, too. Are you genuinely trying to connect with the other person? Find common ground? Or are you just trying to, like, score points?
Right.
Win the argument?
That's what that benevolence trust is all about. It's about demonstrating that you care about them and that you're coming to the conversation from a place of goodwill.
And that's something people can sense, right? It's hard to fake.
Absolutely. So I think that's a really good takeaway for our listeners. As you're preparing for these conversations, take a moment to check your intentions. Are you coming from a place of love and understanding, or from a place of ego and division?
That's a powerful question. And I think it's one that we can all ask ourselves, not just when it comes to politics, but in all of our relationships.
Yeah, definitely.
I think this is a great place to wrap up our deep dive. We've explored a lot of really valuable insights, practical strategies for having these more productive conversations.
We have, and we hope these tools will empower you to navigate those challenging discussions with more confidence and grace and a spirit of connection.
Right, because even in a world that feels increasingly divided, meaningful dialogue and positive change are still possible.
They are, and it starts with each of us being willing to listen, to learn, and to build bridges instead of walls.
Well, thank you for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those conversations going.